Diana, I'm a big fan of your work, and I was thinking back now how long we've known each other.
It
Um,
is a long
it's
time.
a really long time. It was very early on in both of our careers, so it's been 20 plus
Yeah.
years. And many reasons I'm excited to talk to you. We have a lot of one-on-one conversations, but I'm excited to talk to you because I've been having so many conversations with people in the product and UX world just saying, what's going on? And what is happening in our industry and why? So I was hoping to use this conversation. I've heard a little bit of your take, and I'd love to hear, Donald, Chris, your take as well. But I'd like to start the conversation there. Why I was so excited to be talking with you is you've had an extensive career, and your career has spanned smaller startups to large scale enterprises. We met when you were working at the MathWorks, but you subsequently moved on to many other companies, including Oracle, Autodesk, SmartBear. So I thought, given your wealth of expertise at many different types of companies and your extensive experience, who else would I want to talk to? It was going to be you. So to start, that was my introduction, but I wanted to give you a chance before we jump in and say, what's going on in the UX space? Can you share a little bit about your career and how you've landed where you are now?
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like where I started was very much where the industry was at the time. I was at a privately held company that was really big and profitable and had the goal of software companies at the time of growing indefinitely in perpetuity until the founder decided to retire, and then it would continue on. Or who knows? He still hasn't retired 25 years later. I have been at really large companies like Oracle, Autodesk. I didn't last long at Oracle, all things being fair, and Nuance. And I've also been at New Relic. So small companies, small startups, some you've never even heard of. And I was even in the defense industry for a hot minute. So I've seen it all, and I've watched the industry change. So I would say at the heart of what I do is complex applications. So I was in healthcare. I was in mostly pharmaceutical trials, but also medical coding and billing. I've mostly done a lot of engineering applications. If there's an engineering discipline, I've supported it somehow or other. And like I said, a minute or two in the defense industry. And then the last couple of years have been DevOps. So really tools for engineers, which has been an interesting shift. So yeah, I just work on complicated stuff. There's always pros and cons of big versus small companies. I like both ends of it, depending on where I'm at in my career, or what kind of stability or predictability that I want. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I work on a lot of things. I've moved back and forth between being in management and being a designer too. It's only this last, I think, chunk of time that I've really moved on to firmly being in management and not moving any pixels around.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I mentioned that we're going to go where the conversation brings us. And I mentioned I'd love to talk with you about the state of the industry. But
State of the
before we
thing.
do, I've had so many conversations with UX professionals trying to figure out what their path is next. And you mentioned there's pros and cons to small organizations versus large organizations. But for those who are in-house considering making a shift or looking for opportunities, what considerations do you think come into play in terms of deciding on the size and type of organization?
I think really what you should look at is what kind of impact you want to have. The smaller the org, the bigger your impact. That's always true. I think in this day and age, trying to focus on stability is impossible, right? Because everybody's having layoffs. It doesn't matter. You can go at a big company, but it doesn't mean you're going to have much more stability than a startup. So for me, it's what is it that you want to get out of the role and who's going to best support that, whether it's having influence or a chance to flex certain kind of muscles, or you just want to be in a positive environment. So look for the green flags of whatever it is. But for me, big companies have such specific localized cultures. You can't even really describe Oracle as a monolith because because usually it's a bunch of acquisitions, right? So they maintain their corporate cultures even after. I see a hand.
Oh, yes. So how do I see the hands? Please feel
Oh,
free to
it's
ask
in,
a
yeah. It
Okay.
shows up in the little view. I like.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
Oh, you're muted.
That time Zoom was right. I was going to extend on that sort of in the contextualness of it. What was it? There's different, can be wildly different, right?
Mhm.
In my experience within large organizations, subsets.
Mhm.
So working within a large organization, it's really hard as a job seeker
Mhm.
to pick and
Mhm.
choose
Mhm.
or to know what you're getting into. But
Yeah, I think green flags are rarer, but look for those. I think you can never really know a company until you're on the inside. And as someone who often is coming into leadership positions, I actually think that's harder to really get a read on, because I've definitely walked into startups where the beautiful pitch that I was given did not match the reality. And not intentionally, because I think in their heads they thought it did, but you get there and you're like, but this is what's happening, right? I think it's a little easier as a designer because you can ask questions during the interview process and you can hear, like, even if they're telling you the happy story, you can smell it, right? So as a designer, you want to know what happened. One of the favorite questions, what happens when there's a disagreement between design and PM? How does that get resolved? Right? Like, you can ask those, how does PTO look around here? Do people take their time off? You can ask cultural questions and you will be able to get a solid read on whether or not it's the fit you're looking for, right? What I've noticed too, it's such a weird market and it's such an employer's market. I've talked recently to a seeker who was looking at a company that I knew very well, and I was very realistic with him about what that role would look like. And he was like, he has a mortgage to pay, right? So he was going to continue on anyway, but at least he'd go in with his eyes open. And I think that's the difference. You can know it's a wonky culture, but if you know it going in and you intentionally make that choice, it's a little more comfortable than if you get there and are surprised by it. So I think it's a tricky time because I know a lot of people are compromising on things they might otherwise not, just because of the market.
Diana, you spoke to some of the questions you can ask, and given you can smell when there's a wonky culture and you have a sense, what are some of the red flags you hear when you're going through the interview process? Are there certain things that come up that you go, whoa, you may be willing to compromise, but some of the answers you might get that indicate this isn't necessarily the right place?
Uh, it's different for everybody, right? So for me, it's always cultural things. It's, is there a healthy way to disagree? Is it an open culture where disagreement is supported, or is it a culture of toxic positivity, right? Is design really designing, or are they just pushing pixels because that's all anyone wants from them, right? Are they just picking colors and fonts, right? Which, so you can suss that out. Is there an existing design system, right? Have they invested in their design group to the point where there's operational functions happening? And some of those more low-level tasks are already off the plates of the designers. What kind of projects are the designers working on? So you can really get a sense of that. Like I said, it's different for everybody. Sometimes you might want to take a gamble just for a role that's going to give you a little more exposure or experience just because that's on your next step, or maybe the money's really good, right? I will say sometimes when the money's really good, you should actually dig a little further because usually there's a reason. Right. There's a reason Facebook pays a lot of money, and it's because it's not a great place to work. I'm sorry. I should maybe settle that. But so when salaries are inflated, that's also a flag too. Like if you're like, ooh, take a pause because there might be a reason. So I think it's just what starts feeling too good to be true, or where are you hearing things that sound a little off? Yeah, it's so different for everybody. I don't want to be prescriptive about it, but
That's a nice segue too. There was another reason. Please be candid, Diana. How do you really feel? It's another reason why I really wanted to talk to you, because you are always very upfront about your take on
it's a
things. And
problem.
it's not. Having people be authentic right now is huge. And I do want to get into it now because I've heard a little bit of your take on what's going on right now in the industry, in the tech industry, the UX industry. And yeah, let's get into it. So this is an understatement. It's a challenging time right now in tech and UX. And I'd love to get your take a little bit. You've talked about how the industry and the tech community has evolved. Can you talk a little bit about your perspective on why we are where we are?
Yeah, first I would say it's not just us, right? This is a moment in tech in general. And as someone who has been around for 25 years and has seen the dot-com bust and other things, this isn't the first time that people have said that it's the death of UX, right? It's like weight loss drugs, right? Every 5 years, it's a new thing, right? And this isn't the first time I've heard people say it. I don't believe it because that ship has sailed. There's never not going to be product designers like that and researchers. Like that's just the reality of it. I do think it was an overheated market. There was one point when I was seeing people make money off of just teaching portfolio classes as a solo practitioner and doing portfolio reviews. And I'm like, there's just too much money floating around right now, watching some of the things that people were doing. So it felt overheated to me the way it felt overheated in the dot-com era, where you didn't actually have to have a business plan. I remain stunned at how many companies don't have to be profitable for years at a time and still get funding. So that was always a worry to me. And so this is the correction that we were overdue for. But having said that, I think the source of the money has changed the tech industry fundamentally. So I started at a company that was privately held, that was designed for the long term. It was a legacy company. They were not open to being acquired, and that was the goal. And I don't think I've ever been at a company like that since then. You're not just getting private funding. I think when the MathWorks is decades and decades old, but I think when they started, it was family friends funding it. There were no VCs, there was no private equity. And so which is one of the many reasons why they remain privately held, right? That economic map is not in use anymore. You have an entire generation of founders that weren't even working during the dot-com bust. So they've only known tailwinds, right? They've never known a time when funding was tight until recently. And they have no experience with it, and they don't see it coming, right? A lot of founders were caught off on their heels by this. Yeah. It also changes the horizon, right? While 5-year plans were always bananas, a 5-year plan is basically from funding to the next equity event, right? And at that equity event, somebody's got to cash out, right? So the timelines are shorter. The focus is on short-term ROI. And that changes how they're going to look at results over time. There's not an interest of this company lasting forever. That's not the goal, is to cash out in 5 years. And frankly, founders are rewarded for the money they raise and not the success of the company. You can fail spectacularly, piss away a lot of founders' money, funding money, but still succeed later. So it's just a really there's different outcomes. And I think the software shows it. Like there's a lot more crappy software out there. And there's less of an interest in investing in long-term things like design and research, because your whole focus is skewed toward the short term. And ownership by private equity. I have to be honest, I've never seen anything that's gotten better when a private equity firm owns it. I was recently at an event, not even tech related, and we had met the former owner and found out that he'd sold to private equity. And I was like, oh, that's why all the vendors have started to not be great the last couple of years. And you're having staffing issues. And this is how I've never seen private equity make anything better, because they're focused on quick outcomes and quick revenue. And they're not focused on the long term and the overall quality of an investment. I think that has fundamentally affected the industry. And I think it's one of the reasons why we're seeing such a divestment of design, because if your only interest is to get to your next, you're a year away from your next equity event, you don't really need the designers. You know what I mean? You can let them go, right? Because you're just going to be heads on focused on sales. And not that's the wrong thing for the business. If you're I love the book Tyranny of Metrics. What you measure is what you move to, right? And if you're moving to just the financial outcomes for the company and you're not looking at the quality of the product, then that's what you're moving to.
Absolutely, Diana. Yeah, Donald has a question for you.
This would take things in a slightly different direction. So I don't know how you want to moderate, Christine. But I did want to expand on one intermediate point, which was the irrational exuberance of it seems like the pandemic was the kicker on the end of that, and the go online, and things blew up. And so part of it was, from my perspective, like all of a sudden there was a salary dynamic at play, where it's like, it used to be, sure, Silicon Valley can pay Silicon Valley prices because they have Silicon Valley cost of living. And then all of a sudden you had remote workers who were making Silicon Valley prices without having to move to Silicon Valley. But my I guess there's a couple of things. One is around I'm trying to figure out, there's a lot of back commentary on CEOs who are like, oh, boo-hoo, my company's not doing well. Something happened. I have to lay you off. Calling bullshit on them. And I'm
Yeah,
wondering about making this a little more personal to UX leaders. Should, hate the word, but I'll use it anyway. Should UX leaders have said, this is crazy. I'm not going to add headcount because you're just going to cut it in 2 years. Or they
I
like,
did.
no
Right.
way.
But it doesn't matter. So yes. So to be honest with you, so I joined a startup that was in hypergrowth. They had just gotten $1.5 billion in funding that they weren't even seeking. Like people came to them because it was post-pandemic and they were in the video space and video was blowing up. Like entire companies grew and failed because of the pandemic, especially in the video space. And there was, at a certain point during that growth, it started to seem weird that I had as much headcount as I did because the engineering hadn't filled their recs. We were starting to outpace PM. I felt like we had a lot of PMs. So like even matching the PM 101 didn't make sense. So I was a little reluctant to lean in. And it wasn't too far after that that we then had our first rounds of layoffs. What's different now versus back in the day is back in the day or at larger companies, you'll smell the layoffs, right? Because they will start taking cost-cutting measures sooner. You'll start seeing travel go on hold. You'll start seeing recs go on hold. I can say I have seen companies that have had layoffs hiring right up until the layoff and right after the layoff. And a lot of companies will say economic headwinds. And true, there were economic headwinds that got you to this layoff. But you know what? Your fiscal responsibility is to prepare for those and have those as a possibility in your modeling of the future. And you should be able to check in to say our revenue is not where it should be. So we got to lean back on our spending. And that behavior I have not seen in tech in a while, in part because this is the first time we've had significant headwinds like this since the dot-com burst, right? I worked for Autodesk during the housing crisis. That affected a lot of their business, but they still had places. So we were having layoffs and things, and we were struggling as a public company. They bounced back and it was fine. And even that was such a micro cause, like it didn't affect a lot of other industries and certainly not tech as a whole. So I think there has been a fiduciary responsibility that some CEOs have not been doing, where they say, we should pull back on spend. We should not. The concept of hypergrowth has always made me insane because no other business will it lean in like that. And I don't know why tech companies think it's okay to spend ahead of your revenue so much, because there's still economics involved. And so I think what we are seeing now is more conservative approach to growth, because you can't really throw all those people at a company and not affect its stability, especially a startup. So I actually have never been a huge fan of hypergrowth. And when I was a part of it, I was like, going with it because it was a Bay Area company and I was like, oh, this is what we do. But even in it, I felt uncomfortable, and rightly as it turned out.
Diana, can I ask you,
Sure.
this is piggybacking off of Donald's question a little bit. You have such a nuanced approach, and the worldview, it's a complicated mess right now. And it's not what I've been thinking a lot about. There's been a lot of discourse in the UX and product community about this age of reckoning. And Donald spoke to, is there an opportunity for UX leaders to own their part? Judd Anton, from a UX research leadership standpoint, has been saying this is an age of reckoning. How can UX leaders, research practitioners have done things differently? How do we show our influence? I see you. And that's where there's a broader, bigger picture to this, that we as product and UX leaders can own our part and can see what we could do differently. But you're talking about there's other dynamics at play that have really nothing to do with what the UX leadership and product leadership was doing. I'm curious what your take is about the age of reckoning and what we should be revisiting. Is that something that we should focus on? Or as you mentioned,
I think
age
it's
of hyper growth.
Yeah, I think it is an age of reckoning for tech because the financing has changed. And so the models are changing. There is no free money. Will that last? Hard to say. You know what I mean? It depends on the overall economy. We could easily come back to this in a year. You know what I mean? And no lessons will have been learned. Because again, if people are measured by the funding and not the health of the company, then that's what they will work towards and that's what they will prioritize. And if there's no consequences to someone for running a company into the ground or overspending, because a lot of boards just don't board, they really don't weigh in. But I don't think it's an age of reckoning for UX. Now, should we have done things differently? Can we do things differently? It's hard to say. We do what we can. I think as an industry, I have seen design move more consciously towards being connected to business outcomes. And it is useless to be a voice for the user if what you're advocating for does not help the revenue of the company. Like, then what you're doing delivers no value to the business. And if it doesn't deliver value to the business, then there's no point in delivering value to the user, because the user, the company may go out. So I do think that I have seen a greater connection between the work we do and supporting the business. I don't know that I've seen enough of it, and I do think that does hurt us. I think not being tightly, there is still the perception that we're just colors and finish and polish and pixels. And I think drawing that connection and being more involved in the quantitative analysis and tying everything we do back to a business goal is something we could do more of. But I don't think it's for lack of trying. I certainly think there are leaders in design who aren't aware of it and don't care because they're focused on craft. If I could eliminate the word craft from everyone's vocabulary, maybe I would do that. But I do think we don't always do the best service to ourselves. And so we seem more disposable than we are. A lot of times people just aren't that interested in changing their mind. Design is this to them, and that's what they want it to be. And it's been an uphill battle. The number of times I get told, and Christine, you've heard me rail about this before, at a director level role that they want a player coach, but you have a seat at the table. And it's okay, stop. If I'm a player coach, I'm already doing two jobs, and neither of them is a strategic one. So I may have a seat at the table, but nobody's going to care what I have to say because I'm not involved in the conversations that I should be, because you have me involved in other work, right? And typically speaking, no other roles have to go through this player coach nonsense, and no professional team ever has had a player who is also a coach ever. Mm-hmm. Chris, mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm probably pushing everyone's button with that.
No, all this is great. I agree with all this. And I guess my question is, and I think you're right, looking back and going, this is a reckoning, and somehow UX has not marketed itself properly or whatever. I think we've been making the same argument about our role in a company and whining about the same lack of influence for the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like something needs to change. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious about your thoughts about the role of UX leadership. Mm-hmm. In general. I was looking at somebody's portfolio, leader level, like VP mm-hmm. level portfolio, and I couldn't discern from.
Because why would a VP have a portfolio? Show me one other VP level job that requires a portfolio. Right?
Because, this person had taken a presentation view, and they're just showing off the kinds of stuff they've done, which I think if you're going to get a VP level job, talking about your accomplishments seems reasonable. Sure. But the thing that struck me, that there was a whole thing on the beautiful designs that had been done for a product that was a complete failure because it did not know its market at all. It was just went crosswise to the way the users, it ignored something big about the users. And I'm like, why are you showing that? Like, why, if as a VP level, I would expect you'd want to be in a position to tell the CEO or the CPO, or just don't build this, right? And I'm wondering, do we need to have that kind of a voice to have the impact on the bottom line that we want?
Yeah.
How do we get
there is, now I was an individual contributor, but there is an example in my portfolio of a really great design that frankly has a patent on it that I'm not sure the full version ever shipped, because it turned out that they were pulling the plug on the product, one of the products altogether. And frankly, for reasons that they should have known before they ever invested in it. There was no new information, and it wasn't even from research. It was like market cap. This was a commodity product. Like, it wasn't, there was a reason they thought they might have an opportunity, but like in the end, it was just not cost effective. Training a system's really expensive, and it wasn't delivering the benefits that they had thought it would. But you know what? All that should have been known ahead of time. Now, I was never involved in any of the conversations. I found out it was being canceled at the same time the rest of the company was. I certainly wasn't. The project had started actually before I got to the company, but I wouldn't have been in those conversations anyway as an IC. And a lot of times the ship has sailed before so you have a choice in design, right? Of saying no and being the negative Nancy in the room, even if you're right, and it's going to go forward without you. Or you try to mitigate the damage as you go because they're saying no. Now, having said that, Chris, yeah, we should say no. We should say, hey, I think this is going to be a problem. And then when it comes to fruition, you can not say, I told you. But that has been the trick of design is we are very rarely in the C-suite. VP roles in design, if a VP lasts longer than a year, and it's amazing, right? The average tenure of a design VP is a year. And I've seen that in person time and time again. Yeah, there are exceptions, right? Tom Tullis was at Fidelity forever. I can think of a few other people that have been in roles for a few years, but in the grand scheme of things, when I was in New Relic, it was a revolving door, right? They had a new VP of design. I think they've had two since I've left, and I've only been gone like 3 years. It's tough because it's not a position where you're attended to. And it's amazing to me that we've all worked in design and research, and you're usually surrounded by women, but most of the C-suite are men. And I will say, candidly, most of the C-suite, and this is design, most of the C-suite in general is men, but in design, it's very rarely women who are in the leadership roles. And I have seen the most successful leadership who aren't even designers. So what does that tell us? I don't know what the message is there. Are we too in the weeds that we can't talk at the right levels? Is leadership too disconnected from the users that they can't raise those concerns? So I don't know what the issue is, but there's definitely something there that people who come from a design background often don't get put in those leadership positions for their own discipline, which is fascinating to me for so many reasons. But
I'm curious if it's...
And yet they want player coaches who are in Figma for director level. Like, it's such a strange thing.
It sounds like, Diana, and I'm curious if this is also your take. There's been a lot of discussion about where UX should reside in the organization and what will lead to the most influence. And what I've found, and you seem to be speaking to this, I've said, like, I've seen organizations where UX has influence, and it has the number one key indicator has been whether someone is in the C level. It doesn't have to be a chief design officer or chief insights officer, but someone who's the evangelist, not even for the UX team, but the evangelist for the user experience and the customer experience. That's what I found as the number one indicator. I'm curious your take, if it comes down to that, or if there can be a bottoms up approach.
You have to have an advocate outside of design at the executive level, even if design is at the executive level.
Okay.
Because one of the things that I saw, I had a VP who walked out the door while I was employed there, and he at this company, and he'd been in the seat for 1.5 years. And I actually knew he was in trouble even before that happened, because his whole focus was within design. So we did a lot of great work. We even did speculative work that nobody knew about. He had no allies outside of design, which you're dead in the water. As a VP, that's literally your job, right? If you read Peter Merl's book about design orgs, he had no allies, and the GMs did not care for him. And so he was dead in the water because there was a new CPO, and it just wasn't going to work for him because he didn't have any traction. And the person they replaced him with didn't build those allies either. And she was fired within another year. Sometimes those people don't want to be your allies, but if you don't have that kind of relationship where other people are supporting the work that design is doing or pushing it forward or advocating for you, you will not succeed, even if you have a real seat at the table. I have never really cared about where I reported in. My answer to that question is, where should design be? I want to be where the power is.
Yeah.
So sometimes that's engineering. You want to be as close to engineering as possible. But at one org, it was PM. And I was delighted to be there because they had the big bat. So all I had to do was go to my PM and be like, they're doing this, and it would get changed. And you want to go with whoever's going to advocate for you and whoever has enough power to support you and shield you. And wherever that is, that's where I want to be.
We talked about this even prepping for this session, where there are a lot of challenges for UX leadership. And I'm wondering, Chris, for example, said, I wonder what UX leadership can do differently in this environment. Is there hope.
There's
I know
always
finding,
hope, right?
yeah.
I think I don't know how this moment is going to end, right? I don't know what's going to be on the other side of this. Are people just going to be more conservative about growth, or are they going to forget everything they learned? At the end of the day, if you want to ship good experiences, you need design in the room, right? And I don't care what kind of experiences they are. I don't care if it's APIs or front end or what it is. The engineer who's writing the code cannot be also responsible for the experience of the customer. As no matter how good they are at it, they are optimizing for good, effective code. They can't do that and worry about the experience at the same time. I think a great engineer has sensitivity to it, but you can't, those are two jobs, right? And so I think if a company really values what it's putting out there, it's working with researchers and designers. And a company that doesn't understand how to leverage us, I do think there's a real misunderstanding of what the investment looks like and why they should have it and what to get out of it. And I don't think we've delivered that well, in part because design works so differently at every different company. If it is a more consumer-oriented company, visuals and aesthetics are more of a concern than if it's at an engineering product used by hardcore engineers who are trained on the system, right? Like it does, I've had different titles my entire career and always the same job. So it is tricky because we've done ourselves our own disservice in that way, I think, in making it really confusing to understand what we do. Like engineers, it's clear. You come in, you write code, boom. Like, but what does design do? Well, yeah, it's fuzzy depending on the org. So I do think there's hope. We just have to, it's org by org, right? Yeah, we do rebrand. Yeah, I've been a product designer. I started out as a usability specialist because we couldn't call ourselves designers. That was a specific org thing. I've been a UX person. I've been a human systems engineer. I've had all the titles. My work has never changed, right? Like it's ridiculous.
I feel you. That resonates too. And given the climate now, no one's visiting my LinkedIn every day, but it's been a little bit of identity crisis. Should I call myself a user experience professional, a product strategist? Oh, customer experience versus user experience. And there's a lot of, it's coming down to, it's not about the positioning on the LinkedIn page that will lead to people seeing our value. And I realize,
but it is what gets you past that first screen,
yeah,
right? Like having those specific words. So that's what's tricky. To your question, Donald, I don't think that those challenges mean it's a failed product. We are changing our names based on the industry. I wanted to call our team UX at my last startup for a dumb reason. Our company had UX in the name. And so I thought there were a lot of cute branding opportunities. But we were product designers, right? Now, originally when the team had formed, that also covered marketing design. So I thought it might be good to rebrand because there was a separate marketing team now that did handle those things. So for me, it was also like, make sure that people understand we're doing something different. But when I talked it through with the team, they didn't want to change the title. And because they felt like product design was the more current and contemporary term, and they wanted to make sure that at their next job, people understood what they did. And I was fine with that. So I kept it because I do think product design is an accurate and legitimate title. I think it's just the trends change. And so we try to go with that so that we can identify with what we're doing. UX is fuzzy, but product design is clear. Okay, design the product, right? I don't know. I think it's just, we don't know who we are or what we do. And we are multitudes, right? There are so many disciplines within design. There's visual design and interaction design and system design and like service design and research. It's just all the things. Yeah, it is also. So it really is just framing ourselves to be more relevant and picking the framing that works for you. But yeah, now that we've got these days of systems, although I think the best way to not get a job is to apply for it, right?
Absolutely. Diana, we have on this call, we have a lot of seasoned, experienced professionals. Thing I did want to ask you about for more of the designers first coming into their careers, you mentioned that one of the biggest, most important aspects of having influence and gaining traction is to identify who in the organization has the power and to figure out how to navigate the organization to align with those people. I know, as we've talked about, you've been at so many companies. For more of those junior practitioners trying to figure out how to align with those with power, do you have recommendations and techniques in terms of how?
Stay local.
Well,
You don't
to
have to worry
influence.
about that. If you're an individual contributor, those are not your concerns. Like those are meta concerns for the leadership. If I'm a designer, I'm working with one team. So build those relationships, like who has power on that team, right? That's easy. And who's going to implement your stuff, right? Make sure you have a close relationship with that person. I had an engineer, I was doing a player coach role, and I had one engineer who was so great. All I had to do, he would always make my designs better. He was a talented front engineer. He was very quick. He would say no to anything you ever asked him to, but he never meant it. He just wanted to make sure you really wanted it. And so I made sure I had a good relationship with him because I could literally hand him a napkin and he would implement something, right? And he could be difficult. He didn't like you. We had a very close relationship, but build those relationships on your team. Build a relationship with your PM. Build a relationship with your engineers. Make sure you know your salespeople because they can hook you up with the field. Build those relationships. And it's actually easier because it's a smaller set of people. You don't have to worry about the leadership and all the alignment and whatever. You have one team. At most, it's 15 people, right? Navigate that team, build those relationships. And those relationships will serve you both in that job and in the future. I mean, we are influencers. We are not implementers. And so those relationships are critical to success in any role.
Absolutely. I have there's a monster topic that I want to bring up, but before I do, we're going to talk about AI before I move in that direction, because we could spend hours. Are there any questions for Diana just about what we've talked about before we move on to thoughts on generative AI and where we are?
I guess I have a question, and that's within the community, there's so much about how great we are. If only people would listen to us. And
usually that's from consultants. I'm just going to say it.
Not only
our thought leaders are consultants who haven't been in-house ever, right, who also have been around for 30 years. And maybe I'll leave it there.
Please be candid.
I know.
Right. But the truth, my current CEO likes to say the truth is in the market. So there's a part of me that's okay, this whole we have to convince people stuff is missing the point. And really it's all about going back to whatever that guy's was, philosophy of science, right? Change only happens when people die, right? It's generational. You can't convince the current set of two boards not boarding. You can't convince the current set of Harvard MBAs that design is really important. You have to wait for them to retire and then in 20 years.
So I disagree with that. So look, people don't understand what we do, and yet they've invested in us to the point where the growth for product design roles has been bigger than I've ever seen it, right? The demand for designers was so big that all those certificate programs blossomed and bloomed and were a cottage industry. People don't get what we do, but they still believe it enough that they have hemorrhaged money hiring us all over the place. Imagine what they would do if we actually could help them understand. So I don't think that people that need to die for the next generation, but I think I would like to see new thought leaders speaking up and being referred to. I am a little tired of the same people that were very relevant when I first started at the dawn of the internet, recycling their old content and still talking about it like they're relevant. I would like to see they still have something to contribute. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but they should not continue to be our only thought leaders. They really shouldn't. I would love more in-house people to take on that role. I guess it's a consultant's thing anyway, but I would like to see a younger generation really come up and take that over. But I don't think it's the Harvard business students. Like, we've made the case for the value of design. I think as designers, we need to make sure that we're delivering outcomes. Now, that can be really hard, right? If you're working on a product that's going to be dead in the water because they didn't do the right work up ahead and you can't influence that, it's hard to deliver a great outcome. But I do think we do ourselves a disservice by focusing on the user and the design and not often enough on the business. I had a mentee who was frustrated because she wasn't being viewed as a senior designer, which I feel like the bar for that used to be 5 years, you were senior, now it's 3 years, you expect to be senior. There's complicated things around leveling, but she actually was a really great designer and was on the cusp, I would say. But she wasn't perceived that way. Now, a lot of it was because she had a very soft, almost juvenile style of conversation and presenting herself. And I think that was hurting her. But I did ask her, in these conversations that you're having, Are you focused in completely on tactics and like executing on what they're asking you to, or are you even engaging them in discussions that are a little higher level? Like, how are you showing up to influence this? So I think that's a metaphor for what we could be doing differently. We can't control a lot of things, but we need to make sure that we're delivering outcomes that resonate with the business so that we don't get laid off, right? So they see our value. And we need to try to influence. Sometimes, look, maybe get an I told you, right? Like, we said this would be a problem and look what happened. Like, we could have avoided this, right? It can be hard because a lot of times we're swimming upstream, but I think our focus should not be the design. Our focus should be what ships. And if we pull back, I once had a director who was like, oh, I'll only rate you guys based on what you design, not on what ships. And I appreciated what he was saying because there were a lot of challenges with engineering, but what ships is what matters. That's what's going to influence our revenue. So I need to worry about what ships and not what I'm handing over as an artifact to other people. And I do think our worldview needs to expand to understand and recognize that our job isn't just the production of a design or delivery of research findings, right? It's making sure that it gets in the drinking water. It's making sure that people understand what the implementation needs to be and what problems we're solving. So I think our role is actually bigger than what we focus on. All this, we haven't communicated that successfully. The fact that people are still asking me about Figma as a director, okay, sure, I can use Figma. You don't want me to. I am the worst person on the team to push pixels, right? I can. But so I think we need to shift the conversations away from tools, which is easier now because Figma is everything. It's all Figma, at least for the next few years, and really focus on what we're delivering and what our value is. Yeah, good investment. And I think that's why we have to also focus on the quantitative piece. If the quantitative, now, when I was coming up, we were responsible for our own data, qualitative and quantitative. But now you've got data analytics teams, partner with them, make sure that you're extending your view into what's the data telling us once we ship, right? So that if you get into an organization that wants to do quick experiments, you can support that, right? What's the leanest design? What's the smallest feature? I think we just get too wrapped up in the craft and the delivery, and the output isn't the design. The output is the software, right? And so I do think there's a shift that we need to have, because a lot of the conversation is around the work that we do and not how the work that we do actually gets to the customer.
Mm-hmm. Diana, can I ask you, I know your thoughts on this, but from a UX leadership standpoint, and as a UX leader, there's been a lot of different takes and perspectives on what the implications of AI will be going forward. And what I mean by different perspectives, some in the UX community see huge possibilities and looking at use cases that may lead to increased efficiencies, whereas other leaders are talking about this being the age of potentially regret for our UX community not speaking up more. Again, how much do we own our part? But I'm wondering what's your take in terms of implications, and where do you fall on that spectrum?
I won't use the examples that I used when you and I were talking about it, but so to me, I think a lot of this drama is ridiculous in the sense that generative AI is not new, right? Just because everybody got to touch ChatGPT and see it for themselves doesn't mean this hasn't been around forever. I have also worked on products that use generative AI, and I understand the limitation and the costs associated with it. So I think it took people 5 minutes with ChatGPT to see how quickly it breaks down, right? From my perspective and experience, generative AI is best at this stage of the game. Maybe years from now, it's different. When it's tuned to a very specific system and it's delivering on a very narrow use case, right? Reading X-rays, I think is an excellent use case for AI. I've heard of a company using it not for customer service, but to help mortgage lenders give better information to customers, right? Because mortgages are like, they follow a rule set and you can train it and they can deliver good information and options and suggestions as you're supporting a customer. I don't think generative AI is at the point where it can do anything for anything. But having said that, we've already seen places where either because the lack of diversity was in the room when things were coded or things were trained on the wrong system, what things can go sideways. Facial recognition doesn't always do well with people of color because it wasn't tuned for that, right? It wasn't trained well for that. There's a lot of examples like that. And I do think as AI grows, I don't think we have to get spun up yet. I think we got a long time before the robot revolution is a problem, but I do think we have to not go into it with our eyes closed, like we did when the internet came around. And it was like, what could go wrong? Everything, right? Because it's humans. It's not the AI that's the problem, right? It's the humans and their application of it. The AI itself is still really, I don't want to say infancy, but it's not, it still takes so much to train it, so much cost to train it. That's why companies are trying to get value out of that, right? Reddit has value as an acquisition, not because of the product as an advertising platform, but as a source of training data, right? Companies are rushing to get to that part of it, but we're not at the place where AI is something to be worried about. However, we have to really think about things like, how can this be misused? Because it will be, right? And what kind of legal protections should be in place? Right now, I cannot opt out of the content that Meta is using to train its system. People in Europe can because of GDPR, right? We need to think about things like that. Like, how can I say, no, thank you, you don't have free access to all my data, right? Now, no one ever throttled Google. Back in the day, Google crawled everything, and that's how Google became Google. But we're smarter now. So let's say, no, you can't have my content and use it to train. I think the lessons are there. They've already been there. Just look at the dawn of the internet. What do we need to learn from that? But I also think we have a really long time before it's a problem. But yeah, I think it's the middle of the road. We should think about how it can be misused. Deep fake propaganda, those Joe Biden calls, right? Those fake Joe Biden calls in the primaries in New Hampshire, like those things are already happening, right? Deep fake news. We really have to think about that piece because it's already here and having real consequences. But yeah, I'm not an alarmist. Partly because I think we're so far away from needing to be alarmed. As long as ChatGPT is giving you bad answers, we're good.
You also take and I mentioned this at the beginning of our conversation, you just take such a nuanced approach to your perspectives and you've really thought it through. It's not black and white. So I appreciate
because
that.
It's not. And it's so expensive to train a system. You know what I mean? That's the other thing. I'm like, AI is not free. So until it's free, then we can worry when everybody gets their hands on it, but it's hard. So yeah, I think there's a lot we don't have to worry about yet, but we should be thinking, we should be legislating, we should be doing more for sure, but not a panic.
Thanks, Diana. I wanted to say we have 4 minutes left, and I started the conversation where selfishly I was setting these up so we could have interaction and discussion. I was wondering, we have Diana for a couple of more minutes. Are there we can ask her anything. I'm hoping we're doing these sessions every Wednesday, and I'm hoping, Diana, I can convince you to come back to talk. Sure. We've been talking about getting 2 or 3 people together to talk about certain topics, but I'm wondering if there's any other questions for Diana before we kindly thank her.
Hey, this is Sheena. I have a question for Diana. So I am an in-house researcher at a financial institution. I've been here for about 8 years, started as a designer, and then probably about 4 years ago, the team made a shift into more of a strategic research role. And we moved away from partnering mostly with product teams and instead focused on business strategists and people involved in transformation. If you think about all of the archaic legacy systems used to run big institutions. Yeah, totally. And I'm focused on the employee experience, I should say. It's all the internal cuts. And when teams make a move like that, who are the primary people to partner with? Who do you want to build connections with? And do you use the same approach that you do with product teams?
Yes and no. I don't think it's so different. I think it's just fuzzier for you. Do you know what I mean? Because you're not, it's not like we do a thing and then the product responds to it and then it should, right? It's a little like you're doing internal transformation about things that over which you have very little control, right? Like you can't change those legacy systems. They're not going to go anywhere. And some of them are horrifying. I think only government has it worse than you guys do. And you're dealing with a lot of really archaic stuff that just can only bend so far. I still think it's the same though, because you're still trying to accomplish something. So you still need to talk to those employees and make sure that you're getting the feedback, knowing that you're not going to be able to satisfy everything they want, because also that's just life, right? And that you're going to be supporting the strategic initiatives. But yeah, I think whoever's giving you your requirements, you still need to make sure you're really connected with them. Part of that relationship too is to influence those requirements. I think you need to make sure you have a great understanding of what's coming your way and why. But, and this goes for product designers too with PMs, like you've got to make sure that you can also say, hey, but that doesn't really align with what we've been seeing. Just so you know, you guys are asking for this, but I don't think that, like Chris was saying, there was a big gap that was missed. Like you got to be able to say, I don't know about that. At least you've done your due diligence. They listen or they don't. But I still think you need to have those same influential relationships. They might just be with different people, right? Because you have a different organizational structure. They do think it's your job is to influence, even more so because you're a researcher, right? You've got to make sure the right research is packaged the right way to get to the right people, that you're distributing it to the right. But it's actually, I think, trickier for a researcher in that way, because you know you're not delivering outcomes. You're just delivering information. And so you've got to make sure that you're packaging it, that people are consuming it, that it's hitting the right way, that people are taking it seriously. Yeah, my example for this is probably terrible. When there was a financial guy who basically caught Bernie Madoff, right? He knew that it was a scam, but he wrote a 12-page letter. It's a little bit on the spectrum. So he wrote a 12-page letter explaining this and sent it to the FCC, and it didn't get taken seriously because there's 12 pages, right? So you have that problem. Like you've got to, what's the nugget? What's going to push a button? You have to understand everything about the world you live in order to deliver your results, and not just the people that you're reporting on, right? What does the institution want? So yeah, you've got to do all that work. Make sure you understand what resonates, make sure you understand how to talk to them, make sure, yeah. So I think it is a lot of the same. It's just even harder.
I appreciate that perspective. Thank you.
Hey, Diana, thank you. And thank you all for joining.